Hello, this is the first video for Chapter 9 and Section 11.7 of the textbook. We're going to cover both monopoly and monopolistic competition. This first video starts by going over market power. From there, we'll look at monopoly and see how it differs from perfect competition and go through some examples. And then we'll turn to monopolistic competition, which is going to look like an in-between market structure, in between monopoly and perfect competition. But what is key for you with this video is now we're starting our discussion of imperfect competition models. So monopoly, monopolistic competition we'll discuss in this video series. And then in Chapter 11, we'll turn to oligopoly. So market power is what defines imperfect competition, and it's when firms have some ability to actually influence the market price for their product. So remember, in the perfectly competitive market model, firms are price takers, right? It means they cannot impact the price of their product. They just have to take whatever the market price is. Market power means that firms can now set their price. Market power is going to arise primarily from barriers to entry. So these will be any factors that prevent entry into the market with and so generating large producer surplus. Okay. One of the most extreme examples of firms with market power is a monopoly. And so that's going to be a market structure where we have a single firm serving an entire market. So that one firm is garnering all of the producer surplus within that market. And the barriers to entry are high enough that no other firm can compete with them directly. Otherwise, in the real world, we're going to see mostly monopolistically competitive firms. This is a much more realistic market model, much more realistic than monopoly, much more realistic than perfect competition. It's going to be a market structure where we have many firms selling differentiated products, and there's no barriers to entry, besides the fact that firms are able to make their products different from one another. There are 5 main sources of market power. We'll cover examples of each of these. The first and most important is going to be government regulation. The reason that this is the most important source of market power is that it is one that cannot be innovated around. Firms are going to have a really difficult time innovating in order to avoid this barriers to entry coming from government regulation, often because that regulation is explicitly prohibiting their entry into the market. The other 4 sources of market power are things that firms can innovate around at times. So we'll look at extreme economies of scale, which is when we see instances of natural monopolies. We'll also look at switching costs, product differentiation, which is going to be key for monopolistic competition. And then lastly, if a firm has control of some key input into the production of a good. So starting with government regulation, like I mentioned, these are going to be often the most difficult for a firm to innovate around to try to enter a monopoly market. And again, the reason is that they often prohibit any entry of competing firms. So most explicitly is the prohibition of competition. We see this most clearly with the U.S. Postal Service. In the U.S., no other firm, no other business is allowed to deliver mail, right? Specifically letters. We have companies like UPS and FedEx that can deliver packages, but they are explicitly prohibited from delivering letters. Otherwise, we're going to see things like patents and licensing requirements. So patents and copyrights limit how much of a good someone can produce without paying at least to use that patent or copyright to the owner of the regulation, right? So an example that I like to use is the difference between Ellis versus Red Cross. Both Ellis and Red Cross offer certifications for CPR. If you've ever been a lifeguard or worked in a field where you have to get CPR certified, you've most likely been certified via Red Cross, right? This is the cheaper option. mostly anyone who's already CPR certified can teach you how to be certified in the Red Cross way to give CPR. It's much more accessible. Whereas Ellis has a patent currently, and they have for several years. And so in order for you to learn Ellis, the Ellis method of CPR, you have to be trained by a specific Ellis certifier, right? You have to go to someone who is hired by the company to teach their method. And so the cost for learning that method for getting Ellis certified is much higher, right? And it's due to this patent. So that patent is introducing barriers. No one but the Ellis company can teach someone how to use their method of CPR. Similarly, licensing requirements prohibit entry. So famous example include things like taxi cab medallions from San Francisco, which have been prevalent in San Francisco and New York. These medallions limit the number of people who can serve as taxi cab drivers, and so place that high barrier to entry. If someone doesn't have a taxi cab medallion and tries to offer some sort of ride-sharing service, they will be very forcefully removed from the market by the taxi cab drivers, right? For a lot of these folks who are driving taxi cabs, especially in New York, they've paid upwards of $30,000 minimum often for their medallions, and it's a sort of investment in their retirement. Right, so they are banking on being able to sell that medallion so that they can retire. So anyone trying to offer rideshare services without it is a very real threat to their returns, right? They're reducing their surplus and their profit. And so this this was a really large issue when Uber started operating, especially in New York, because those Uber drivers did not have medallions, right? They were not captured under the licensing requirements that traditional taxi cab drivers were. And so those first Uber drivers were actually attacked by taxi cab drivers. And there's famous news reporting and imagery of an Uber driver's car being burnt by those taxi cab drivers, right? They were willing to engage in that destruction of property in order to protect their gains from that regulation. Medical licenses, like the license you need to be a doctor or nurse, or any other occupational licenses, work similar. It limits the number of people who can provide that service, right? And thereby restricting competition. In New York, we now have regulations where there is a limit on how many Uber drivers can operate. So sort of serving like that taxi cab medallion does for taxi cab drivers. Extreme economies of scale, this means that we would have a natural monopoly. It's a situation where a firm has extremely high fixed costs, such that at whatever output level they produce at, they're going to enjoy economies of scale. And it essentially means they can grow infinitely large without ever experiencing diseconomies. And so the theoretical implication people often take is that if a firm has extreme economies of scale, they're going to take over an entire industry and push out competitors. An example of this that we see in real life is things like utilities. So if you think about your electricity that services your house, often what's required for that is either laying miles after miles of cables or having them, on the electric poles, right, going across miles and miles of land. And so there's a very high fixed cost to servicing for a single user of electricity for the electric company, right? And so once they have all that infrastructure set up and they turn on that electricity service, they can provide electricity to new users, and current users, they can provide more at a very, very low marginal cost, right? Almost zero. And so what that means is that a single firm can service quite a large market. Right. And so what we tend to see is this domination of that market by a single firm. And what people are concerned about is what you can see here in the graph is that the utilities monopolist is going to price above what the perfectly competitive price is. Right. So price above marginal cost. And we'll turn to that when we get into the monopoly model in more detail. To give you a mathematical example of a firm with extreme economies of scale, we can take this total cost function that's written at the bottom of the slide. So we have total cost equal to 100 plus 10 times Q. If we were to find the average total cost of that equation of this firm, we're going to get 100 over Q plus 10. And so as that quantity grows, this value 100 over Q is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so we're just going to see the long run average total cost up for the firm continually falling, right? They're never really going to see those diseconomies of scale emerge. Our third source of market power is going to be high switching costs for consumers. So this occurs when a customer has to forego something to switch to a competing product. So you can think about things like reward points or loyalty programs. So if you have loyalty points with, say, Delta Airlines, you're going to be highly likely to want to fly with Delta every single time and not switch to, say, Southwest, right? Because doing so means you're foregoing your rewards points accumulation towards Delta's rewards program. You might also have built-in technology constraints that make it very difficult to switch. So Apple does this, for example, where they personalize, or not personalize, but have specific types of chargers and ports in their Apple devices. And that means that for someone who has an iPhone, it's very difficult to switch to a Android phone because they're going to have to get all new cords, all new attachments. And then in addition to that, Apple has a unique OS. And so switching to an Android would involve learning a whole new operating system. For high switching costs, you might also encounter a situation where there's high search costs in a market. So this is going to be like in the market for primary care doctors, where it can be very difficult to find a doctor who fits your specific needs and fits them well, right? Someone who you can trust with your care. And so once you find that person, you're going to be very loath to switch because that's going to involve additional search that you've already taken on. And potentially a longer time between your next care visit. Lastly, for high switching costs for consumers, we have network goods. So those are going to be goods whose value to the consumer increases with the number of other consumers of that product. This is the case with things like Instagram or Snapchat, where they're really only valuable to you given that your friends and people you want to connect with are using that platform, right? Most of you are not on Facebook. Why is that? Probably because no one you want to talk to or interact with is on Facebook, right? Maybe your boomer family members are, but you're not necessarily interested in sharing whatever memes or thoughts that you have with them, right? Our fourth source of market power is going to be product differentiation. In product differentiation, we see firms able to produce goods that are very similar to each other, but just different enough that they're not perfect substitutes. So the example I like to use is fried chicken, because despite all of the companies you see listed on the slide here providing fried chicken, people have very strong feelings about them, right? So if you have someone who likes Popeyes, they're going to be very strong in their assertion that Popeyes is different from Cane's and they're not substitutable, right? If they want Cane's, they're going to go to Cane's. If they want Popeyes, they're going to go to Popeyes. They're not equally the same in the consumer's eyes. Probably a lot of you have your chicken place that you go, and you don't really go to any others. So we see with the product characteristics, right? Cane's often with their sauce, Popeyes with their seasoning and breading, that they're able to change the characteristics of that fried chicken to make them different enough that their good is no longer a perfect substitute for each other. You're also going to see product differentiation occur with location. So a Starbucks in the airport is not the same as a Starbucks on campus, is not the same as a Starbucks down the street, right? That convenience means a lot, that closeness to wherever you are and accessibility is going to impact your decision to go to a specific Starbucks over another, right? Maybe you have a Starbucks that's close to you, to your home, but it doesn't have a drive-through, so you go to the one that's a bit farther, right? That is going to be that product's characteristics that change your perception of the two Starbucks. They're in fact not substitutes, right? Um, in in contrast, the one on campus, right, you're more likely to go to than the one across the street because the one on campus doesn't involve a 20-minute walk. Our last source of market power is going to be control of key inputs. We're going to see, in this case, a firm controlling a primary input for the production of a good. The example that your textbook gives is about gum trees, or excuse me, rubber trees, and how a British man was able to figure out how to keep them from getting a blight and thus allowed them to be planted closer to each other in a single greenhouse. And in that way, he was able to control that key input of making rubber at a much lower cost. We could think too about the Coca-Cola recipe, right? If someone wants to make Coke, if you don't have that recipe, you're not going to be able to produce it, right? So that key input is controlled by the Coca-Cola company. And so they're the only ones who can make it, setting aside the copyrights or patents that they have on the recipe. And with that, we'll stop this recording, and the next one we'll look at the monopoly model.